Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. I sincerely hope you will enjoy the webinar that we have for you on Copilot readiness, in particular, navigating data governance, which is, of course, something very, very important for all organizations to consider when implementing AI-based products and solutions. So I thought to begin with, what I would do is just go through a few of the important bits, which is to tell you that the event will be recorded today and shared on our website. So if you don't wish for your audio to be used, then please stick to putting questions in the chat and we'll do our best to make sure we keep track of those and answer as we go through. I sincerely hope you enjoy today. Please feel free to reach out to myself or any of my colleagues at any point after the event if you have any further questions or would like any further information. So just a little bit about Transparity, and I promise you it will be very brief. Basically, our organization is a pure play partner. We're all about Microsoft. We're all about creating solutions for our customers that leverage that ecosystem. In order to be the very best of the best, we have managed to secure all 6 partner designations, as well as 14 advanced specializations, which prove our capabilities to the highest level, with both an external audit and also with the fact that we must continue to perform at the highest level in order to retain those designations. What that means for you is that it means we have great access to Microsoft funding and workshops and assessments, which other partners may not have if they don't have the correct designations. And it also means that when you partner with us, you can trust that we are absolutely doing the right thing and using the best practices available to us within that ecosystem to deliver on your requirements and arrive at the very best of solutions. So today's agenda, and I shall hand over without further ado. So we're going to be looking at, obviously, how data can be used in a high-risk scenario in connection with Copilot. We're also going to be asking questions in connection with how ready your organization is to address these concerns and how to secure your data in order to meet your compliance requirements. And many industries, for example, financial, etc., have incredibly tough regulatory requirements placed upon them to make sure that their data is at all times secure. So I sincerely hope there's some great examples here whereby you can leverage them within your own organization in order to feel safe and secure whilst using Copilot. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to my colleagues, Ian and Terence, who are here today to take you through the presentation and hopefully share with you some great insights.
Thanks, Susanna. So we're going to start off with a discussion on the kind of day in the life of a high-risk user. What you will also just notice briefly is that there's a poll that's popped up on your screen, so you're invited to respond there on the question of, have you started your Copilot journey? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you've purchased licenses. It can be that you're investigating the viability. You maybe got a few folks in IT who've bought licenses. It's something we see quite typically with our customers at the moment. So just a simple yes, no response there if you would like to participate. So I've chosen as an example a fictional person here at Transparity. We don't actually have a deputy head of consulting. I've been dropping hints with my manager and yeah, no one's listening. So we'll just pretend. And we'll see some fairly typical sequence of prompts. So we can use Copilot, for example, in Teams to recap a meeting while the meeting's actually running or after the meeting. And a typical prompt there would be draft an email with notes and action items from this meeting. And I can then address that email to whoever it needs to go to after I've reviewed it to make sure it's all accurate. Another one might be to summarize an incoming email thread. So maybe there's been a dispute with a customer on a particular project, lots of emails bouncing back and forth between the project manager on our side and the customer, and it's now been escalated to the head of a deputy head of consulting. So I can catch up on the salient points of that email very quickly by just clicking the summarize button that's at the top of every email thread. I don't even have to type a prompt to do this. I can then maybe draft an email. So following on from an existing email, hit reply, in the new reply window that comes up, there's a Copilot button I can use, and I can draft a response to inform the customer project's going to be delayed by a few weeks. That summarization capability that we saw with the second scenario is also possible in documents, of course. So from a particular document, I can summarize. I can ask Copilot to generate summary. Now, those first four scenarios are not necessarily very high risk, I wouldn't say, because they depend on data that's in my inbox, which I'm the only owner of. Arguably, the document one, the security there depends on the level of security on the document, which is, of course, dictated by where the document is. So what team is it in? What SharePoint site perhaps is somebody's OneDrive, and the kind of sharing permissions. Now, where we might get a little bit unstuck for a high-risk user is when I start using Copilot to ask questions. So in this particular prompt, I'm typing into Copilot in the Teams chat bot. I'm saying, please write a brief report on best practices for UK mergers and acquisitions in the IT market. And then this happens. I get back a response that says, I won't read out the whole thing in the background. It's basically companies like Transparity, blah, 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 mergers and acquisitions. And by the way, Transparity is planning to acquire a competitor. Now, this is information that I should not have access to. So we have a security breach on our hands. And the reason why in this hypothetical, I must emphasize this is only a hypothetical I had to fabricate, but the likely cause of this is that the person who authored this document is, the person who authored the document has shared it using the default Microsoft 365 sharing behavior, which creates a link that is accessible to anybody in the company. And Copilot is simply obeying the permissions which are in place, and has therefore helpfully, but in this case disastrously, provided me with information that I should not have access to. So this is one of those worst case scenarios that Copilot won't necessarily create, but could possibly accelerate and aggravate. And so now that I've scared you all, hopefully not too much, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ian to talk about what are the mitigations that will help protect us against this kind of scenario.
Thanks, Terence. So yes, now we've understood a kind of a hypothetical situation. I suppose if we look at those tasks that were on that slide from a kind of more of a data governance lens, we need to start thinking about a couple of questions. So the normal questions I kind of think about in terms of interacting with Copilot or any of the kind of AIs was sensitive data accessed? And so sensitive data can mean different things to different organizations. So it could be intellectual property, personal information. Obviously, the example that we've got there is kind of mergers and acquisitions, so kind of confidential internal company. Now, the idea here, I'll just stress, is not necessarily to block all of that, because it may be there is a legitimate reason for them wanting to access that as part of their role. And with Copilot, we are looking to help speed up people's workflows. We just want to ensure that the data that's surfaced is appropriate to someone's role. So that's the data itself that was accessed. Now, also, we've got to ask, what was the data that was in the prompt? So the person requesting that information, what was it they entered? Was the question correct? As in, is it an ethical use of kind of Copilot? Are they asking questions they shouldn't be asking, or are they deliberately going looking for something? Or are they just asking for sensitive information that's contained as part of their role, which is perfectly acceptable? But then we also then need to think about, okay, so we know what they were asking for in that prompt. Do we need to do anything with that prompt data? So do we need to have a ability to audit information that's being asked for in a Copilot prompt? And do we need to be able to keep that? So the idea is if they asked about a project, for instance, does that prompt data need to be kept for the same retention as the rest of the information for that project? Or do you need to actually ensure the opposite? So do you need to ensure that we would normally keep data that was entered into a prompt, but actually this one may pertain to PII? And in that case, do we actually need to make sure it's removed as part of that? And although we're obviously focusing on interactions with Copilot, we are undoubtedly living in an AI age where other assistants are freely accessible. So how do you protect data or even just have visibility when it comes to these? So say you've got a very technical user that's got very used to using a different prompt. And so they're just essentially taking what they maybe put into Copilot, but putting it into another assistant. And also, what about if someone is intentionally kind of trying to circumnavigate it, do it outside of that Copilot environment? I'll come back to that one kind of a little later. So if I just have a look at Terence's example, so saying, was sensitive data accessed? Yes. And was that answered kind of question in the prompt? Do we need to have an audit of that? Well, because it surfaced the data, then yes, we should do. Do we need to keep that? So is it part of a wider retention? Potentially not. You'd want to be, but you would probably want to have a certain amount of retention because of as a baseline to capture the fact that we now have an audit trail of the supposed breach. And obviously in this case, so it's not a third-party AI, so we'll kind of leave that for the moment. So those are the questions that I would kind of normally form in my head when I'm kind of trying to think of a strategy. They obviously, that is a singular example, but those same kind of questions, if you can answer them as an organization, then you will kind of get that strategy for everything else going forward. So we have those scoping questions. How do we then use tooling to kind of answer those and tick those off essentially? Now, the first tool, and Terence kind of touched on it, really is permissions. So there's nothing all singing, all dancing. It's simply having a good framework for assigning permissions for, say, SharePoint, so people in the correct groups. Terence touched on the sharing links, so having the appropriate default sharing links enabled within your organization. And another thing is that quite often gets missed is kind of a permission spool from internal moves. So where you have people that change internally for different teams, they maybe get added into a new location, but do we have a way that we kind of go back and remove them from ones they're no longer within, or do we have a periodic access review process for that? So not a Purview tool, just kind of a good housekeeping. Now, if we look at Purview, kind of your main three for helping answer those questions, or certainly with the first one, how do we provide a backup if those permissions kind of processes maybe slip? There's these three main tools here. So information protection, communications compliance, and data lifecycle management. So first port of call, I'd always recommend the information protection, so or sensitivity label. Now, Copilot or not, I kind of regard this as a foundational part of kind of any data governance strategy, because it provides a tangible classification for an organization and for end users. So it helps drive thoughtful behavior when you're kind of looking to handle that data. And if we apply a Copilot lens, then we can leverage the access control settings within a label, which would help determine what Copilot can surface if it's labeled. So Copilot will just honor the permissions on that. So if you have particularly sensitive data, it's maybe locked down to say a group of users, so like a C-level, then if you do not have the permissions for view, content, and extract, essentially Copilot won't surface that to you. So that's one way in which we can provide a belt and braces approach to permissions, and then also that also helps us, as I drive that user behavior and categorization. Communications compliance is more focused around understanding that question of what's going into the prompt. So it allows you to understand if there's sensitive information or specific things being entered into the Copilot prompts when they shouldn't be. So we're not necessarily saying it's an audit log of everything that gets entered, and someone's got to sit and trawl through all of that. It's more designed to use some of the Purview data classification things like trainable classifiers, and that would be instances things like this Microsoft inbuilt ones for corporate sabotage or regulatory collusion, or for instance a sensitive info type, a passport number, a credit card, although I'm not sure why anyone will go searching for that in Copilot, but you never know. So really it's there to flag when these kind of sensitive items are entered into a prompt, and then you can have those sent for review. That review process can just be a sample. It's kind of based on a percentage. So you can say, right, audit 20% of those just so I can get an idea. Or if you've got someone that's kind of got specific reasons, audit 100% of those. And that's really just to check that Copilot's being used in the correct, responsible manner kind of within the organization. And then you've also got data lifecycle management. So this is going back to the other question about, do we need to keep that data? So data lifecycle management applies across the kind of 365 stack. And much like the way that you would use communication compliance, because it treats Copilot prompts as a Teams or a chat interaction, you can cover those same interactions with a data lifecycle management policy targeted at that. And what that does is Copilot interactions would then actually be stored within a user's mailbox, but although that's not actually accessible to an end user or an administrator directly, so it's only really there for an e-discovery kind of audit purpose. So they're the kind of Microsoft tools or the Purview tools that we've kind of classically used. But as I say, our landscape is always evolving, and we understand that people are kind of using AI assistants outside of the Microsoft ecosystem sometimes. So one of the other features I wanted to talk to you about was AI Hub. So AI Hub is now in public preview, and it's designed to be a bit more of a central portal, which pulls in from multiple pre-existing solutions to kind of give you a single pane of glass into your environment. So we can see on there that there's two tools that we're already talked about. So the data lifecycle management, communications compliance. But then there's two extra tools within there that are very prevalent within the rest of Purview. So that's data loss prevention and insider risk management. So if you remember when I said I consider information protection labels kind of a foundational piece, I suppose I consider insider risk and data loss prevention are the walls that sit on top. And both of those tools are two sides of the same coin. So data loss prevention, you're looking at protecting information being sent or shared externally outside the kind of organizational boundary. And insider risk management is really designed to protect against exfiltration activities from within inside the organizational boundary. So, I mean, traditionally that would be things like downloading a copy into USB. obviously we're not looking traditionally, so we're looking more around AI-focused items. So that's really about how we interact with third-party prompts and understanding what data is being entered into either Copilot or a third-party AI. So this doesn't replace these tools, and it's not kind of swallowing them. It's it's just building a specific policy within those tools, but displaying them all within one central pane of glass, making it a lot easier for you to kind of review and understand what's going on. So AI Hub sounds pretty fancy. So what's the kind of extra value, or what's the new thing that it brings, and how do you need to get going? It's really two main prerequisites. First one is having devices onboarded into Microsoft Purview. This is achieved in either classic sense by Intune or GPO. However, if you've got Defender for Endpoint, it's simply kind of a flick of a switch. And if you were already leveraging anything like Insider Risk or Endpoint DLP, then you'll probably already have this in place. And then the second part is a recommendation to push the Purview Compliance Browser extension. So that's available for Edge, Chrome, and Firefox. And that's to give you that protection about when people are going outside the M365 environment. So what kind of protections does it offer? So I've got an example here on screen, so you can see it breaks it down from the tool set and then the policy. So first of all, we have a insider risk management policy that's looking at browsing in AI assistants. So by leveraging that browser extension, you can then see if someone's going to a generative AI listed domain. Microsoft maintain a list of this. I think it's about 380 odd or so at the moment. But obviously that will continue to grow. And this will audit or could even potentially block, if you wanted it to, if someone was going to a third-party generative AI, entering kind of information into there. And again, these are all customizable, so you can have thresholds. So you may be happy, someone can do it once a day, twice a day, but if someone's doing it 10, 15 times a day, you start to worry about how much data they're pushing out into that. The next two policies are data loss prevention. So I'll actually start with the bottom one. So the discover sensitive prompts in AI assistants. That is very much like a mirror of the communication compliance policy we talked about. So you're looking at where someone is entering potentially sensitive information, but they're doing it into an AI assistant. So again, that kind of Microsoft maintained list of generative AI. And that's just leveraging that browser extension. So that's stopping people circumnavigating to external, was essentially an external website and putting in potentially sensitive information there. And again, that's block and auditable. And you also have the adaptive protection. So adaptive protection is similar, but it's slightly smarter in that it will allow you to do it based on user risk. So if I start trying to send a load of information out that gets blocked by a data loss prevention policy, that I hit that multiple times, it starts raising my user risk. And then essentially just puts a bit of a closer spotlight on me, or brings me into scope of a policy that might block me from trying to kind of put too much information externally. And with all of these, again, it comes down to, it's not just protecting sensitive information, it's making sure that we're kind of being responsive about where users are putting information. So it may not be sensible information, it's just, do you want a third party kind of AI tool to have access to kind of even just day-to-day kind of organizational data. And then finally, you've got the unethical behavior in Copilot. So that's looking at those where we talked about auditing those prompts within Microsoft Copilot. It's then looking at how do we take the things like inappropriate questions or trainable classifiers that may be, again, kind of regulatory collusion, things like that? How do we alert kind of a bit more instantaneously on those? So these are some shiny new features for the world of AI. And yeah, really should provide kind of a really good net to kind of cast around a lot of your information, make sure that it's being used correctly. So that's an idea of some of the protection tooling. I won't waffle on too much longer about that because I know it's not the most interesting subject for me to talk about directly to you. But yeah, feel free to kind of reach out with any questions if you do have them. What I'll do, I'll introduce John. And John's got some Copilot deployment experiences to talk through.
Cheers, Ian. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Moran, so I'm a security and compliance specialist here in the UK market. If you just flip on to the next slide, Ian. So yeah, I'm going to talk today briefly around where we've seen some of our customers deploy Microsoft 365 Copilot, and also our own experience as being customer zero implementing ourselves. So this first slide just talks a little bit about like a sample implementation that some of our customers might go through. We look at both the user enablement side of things and also the kind of technical readiness side of things. Some of those bits we've touched on already today. But some of the top, at this stage here, kind of step one, some of the top questions and queries we get from customers are things like, what's the use case for our own customers or for our users? What's the use case for our roles, for our industry? What's the return on investment for us? How do we measure that? What are the risks involved? I know Ian's touched on some of the risks already, but what should we be aware of for us? But there's other considerations as well that don't always come up, and the ones I've heard a lot are things like, what kind of state is your data in? So Copilot might be able to access a SharePoint site that's 10, 15 years old, but what's the benefit in Copilot accessing that stale data? Is there any benefit? So what kind of state is your data in? Also things like, are there any regulatory specific regulations that you should be adhering to or should be aware of? Is your industry under any guidance that you need to use AI in a certain way? So some of my customers are in a regulated industry that says, they need to, all their AI work needs to be signed off by a human. They need to understand the process that it's gone through to get that answer. And they need to have confidence in the results that AI assistant has given them. So these are the kind of things that we tackle in that kind of step one of these workshops and assessments. If you just click on to the next, please, Ian. So I've just outlined a couple of different workshops and assessments that we typically run with a lot of customers. Top one, the BVA workshop, a change management lab. The bottom right is probably our most popular one. It's the 3-day Copilot workshop. And the bottom left, I'll talk through in a second. That's our adoption accelerator. But these are typically a really good starting point for customers to understand the business value, understand their setup, their risk profile, risk appetite, understand their kind of internal expertise, and where they stand from a risk point of view. So those workshops are pretty much a good starting point, and that's where we've seen a lot of customers accelerate their adoption of Copilot. It's starting with these workshops, and again, we can. Our Transparity can touch on maybe which ones you might be eligible for at the end of the call. But yeah, these are typically a good starting point for customers on that Copilot journey. Click, please, Ian. Some logos on the screen here, and these are all public stories of customers that have successfully deployed Copilot. Each has different use cases, each has had different experiences, each has different considerations from a data point of view. Each has, I suppose, started at a different point. Not everybody has got labeling in place, or you got their access policies nailed down before they roll it out. So I'll share the link to some of these stories if you want to have a bit of light bedtime reading. Go through some of these stories; they're interesting. But But yeah, one common theme I found across some of my customers who've started to deploy Copilot is that risk appetite. So what I mean by that is the customers understand the risk that Copilot or AI can bring, but they've kind of planned accordingly, and they haven't let that risk hamper innovation. So they've understood the risk, but they've adapted, and they've still been able to deploy Copilot because of that. Click on. I'm just going to talk you through what one of these workshops looks like. This is the Adoption Accelerator. This is one customers get once they've bought a certain amount of licenses. But the agenda here is kind of interesting. So this is a typical agenda. I've got 3 slides on it. This is the first one. We always start kind of with the migration of data. So as you know, to get the most of Copilot, it's having more data in your graph, having more data in Microsoft 365. So migrating data across into 365 again is a good first step. Preparing your tenant, discovering sensitive data. What data do you have? What's sensitive? Who has access to it? How is it used? Understanding that risk tolerance. You're kind of who has data access. Are you labeling stuff? That's again a next step. The next one then, identity access management. So you hear us as Microsoft talk a lot around zero trust and zero trust frameworks. The same thing applies to Copilot. So understanding that employees should have just enough access that they need to do their role. So again, same things apply to Copilot. Click on, please, Ian. Yeah, again, with the zero trust, we look at device management, trying to mitigate that device risk. We look at application management, discovering the use and control of AI, not just Microsoft's AI tools, but other ones as well. What's the use across your organization? And building a plan around that. And click on, please. And then, yeah, it kind of comes to then, signing licenses and adoption. So that's kind of just a 3-page slide, but it kind of gives you an understanding of maybe what those workshops look like and what's the running order of customers deploying Copilot. It kind of starts with understanding the business case, the value, look at migrating some data to 365 if you need to, and then the whole labeling and security policies around that too. You just click on. So this is a slide that we kind of use with some customers sometime. I think it's helpful to understand the architecture behind Copilot, to understand what the risks might be for you and for your business. So if you see here, Copilot, the engine for Copilot is towards the top there. And customer or employees or users can prompt through different apps, Word, Excel, Outlook, Teams. And then sitting below the Copilot engine is an instance of the Microsoft Graph. So that's where all your organizational data sits, right? So the Microsoft Graph has long been foundational to Microsoft 365. So it includes information about relationships, activities of your organizational data, and it works together with Semantic Index for Copilot to orchestrate information retrieval using Microsoft Search. So just as you prepare yourself for Microsoft Search, the same thing should be applied for Copilot. We know that by design, Copilot can respect user permissions to any content or any graph information that it retrieves from the graph. So if a user, browses to a site or has access to a file, Copilot does as well. So Copilot isn't, and this is an important thing to understand, Copilot isn't necessarily a super user with any additional privileges or permissions. It's just another service that's built on top of that graph. So understanding what's in the graph is kind of key to understanding what your risks might be when deploying Copilot. Just next slide, please. So again, us as Microsoft, we call ourselves Customer Zero. We've deployed Copilot to over 300,000 employees. I think I heard there's about 250,000 SharePoint sites. So as you can imagine, we've made a few learnings along the way. We've published all of these learnings, or a lot of them, on our website. I'll pop the link in later on as well. But there's some really good data of our learnings in everything from data governance to user adoption, training. So I'm on the clock here, so I'm going to just try and touch on a few of these points or our learnings along the way. So one of the most important elements, and Ian mentioned this already, is to have a labeling policy. So with AI, the primary concern is ensuring that we properly label the data that's contained in the graph, so in SharePoint and in OneDrive, because AI will leverage that label and it will respect the policies behind that label and ensure any content surfaced will drive the user awareness of that label or of that sensitivity. So, you know, if I'm to prompt Copilot and I get a response, that I can see that what the label is behind that response and where it's, you know, where it's showing me or it's citing the reference that what label that's coming from. So again, just some of there's 10 steps on the slide you can see there. Some of them I'll just touch on. So using site labeling, where the default is private and controlled, ensuring that every site with a confidential or highly confidential label sets the default library label to derive from its container. So what I mean by that is a highly confidential site will mean that all new and changed files within that are also highly confidential. A few other bits. So Ian mentioned data lifecycle already. So all teams and sites have lifecycle management in place. So the owner will attest that the contents are properly labeled and protected. I see this myself inside. So if I'm a site owner or a team owner, I will get prompted, and I have been prompted to verify or attest that, yeah, I know who has access to this site or this team, and I'm comfortable that the permissions or the labeling behind this is correct. That's something that we do internally in Microsoft. On the right hand side there, I just have two quotes and from our digital team who implemented Copilot across the business. I think it's a nice kind of summary. So as customer zero for these technologies, we have a responsibility for caution, but not at the expense of enablement. And we're not the most risk adverse customer, we're simply the most risk aware customer. So that kind of goes back to my point that, like, in my experience, the customers that have deployed Copilot already and that are seeing the benefit are the ones that are aware of the risk, but it hasn't stopped them or hasn't hampered their innovation or their ability to move forward. They've just been able to build a plan around it. And the final thing I'll just leave with you is, and I'll pop the link in again, this is a really handy tips and tricks site. You may have seen it already. It just touches on some of the prompts that you can have as a business. So it'll look at different roles that you might have in your business, from sales, marketing, IT, legal, finance, and it give you kind of some idea of kind of how they can use Copilot in their day-to-day. We also have industry scenarios as well, so it'll go through public sector, finance, and give you some idea of, you know, use cases where that might be relevant to your own business. We've got Prompt Buddy as well, which is a really useful add-in to Teams as well, where it'll give you some tips and tricks around prompting as well. So that's my time up. So I appreciate we've come to time, but I hope you got some use from that. I'll pop some of the links into our Microsoft's learning around our deployment of Copilot. And with that, I'll just pass back to, I think, Terence.
Get myself off mute first. Thank you so much, John, for joining us today. John from Microsoft, everyone. So yeah, the next steps that we'd invite you, firstly, in an immediate one, is just to respond to the poll that's up on screen now. So we, as Microsoft partners, part of the Jumpstart program, that we are able to deliver these funded workshops for you. The qualification criteria vary by workshop. So very briefly, we have an initial assessment kind of workshop where you qualify based on your utilization and the kinds of licenses you have. So we're typically looking at E3 and E5 customers there who've got the right kind of utilization levels of SharePoint and Teams. And then for the Adoption Accelerator workshop that John actually had a slide up on screen, there you qualify based on the number of Copilot licenses that you've purchased. And that figure is 300 licenses. But even if you haven't purchased any Copilot licenses and you're worried that your usage might be too low to qualify for a funded workshop, we are, of course, happy to run those for you on the basis that you can either fund the workshops or we can look at some kind of split funding arrangement. So if you are interested in that, or indeed we are also launching a Copilot and Purview workshop, focusing really on the kind of content that Ian covered. So if you're interested in that, or really anything related to Copilot, that we're happy to get in touch with you. So click yes, hit submit, we'll capture your details. I've got a question pop up in the chat there. If you've got fewer than 300 staff, then you can still run that Copilot workshop, but it just won't be funded by Microsoft. So contact us. We'll talk you through the options and the costings, because the ones that aren't funded by Microsoft, we're completely free to customize them to be longer or shorter, and that, of course, will affect the cost. So please do contact us.